The title in the agenda is the other way around, but what we want to do is, first of all, say something about participatory research in terms of what we do as a group and have done historically within the group. Then situate that in this new context of what we're calling planetary crisis, and then tell you something about where living labs fit within that as a process of what we refer to as co-experimentation. Sorry for the slightly academic language. So I thought I'd start. I'm not going to give you a kind of long lecture on what participatory research is, but I thought I'd better read a recent paper and go to the journal that writes about this stuff, just to get a bit of an anchoring for it. And this quote is quite nice in terms of the bit that I've highlighted. So rather than listing lots of participatory methods, what I think is significant is this relationship between systematic inquiry and a commitment to what we call direct collaboration with those who are affected by the processes of action or change that we're interested in. So in other words, what it's about is selecting research methods in a sort of democratic manner that really values meaningful participation, and that can be done at different points in what's called the choice point of the research cycle, if you like. And actually, so we put out a message to our colleagues, said we would put this presentation together, we need your help, we need some examples. And Chris sent me a really nice message to remind me that actually we've had a kind of ethic of participatory research in the group for quite a long time. So back in 2005, there was a collective agreement within the group. So this was before I joined the CCRI, what was then CCRI, previously CCRIU, to avoid doing what we might term sort of extracted research, to try to be more collaborative in the work. So I'll show you a couple of slides that will give a bit of that history. But basically, we're now kind of in fashion. That's what I want to say. So we've now got buzzwords. We've already heard them in the previous talks, like transdisciplinarity, like multi-actor working, and like participatory decision-making. We may not have been using those exact words, but we've been working in this mode for a number of years. So I collated together all the examples that folks very kindly sent me, and Aimee and I have tried to sort of put a narrative around that to give you a sense of the history of participatory research within the group. So the key point and the first point to make is that we've actually had some sort of early innovators. So I was looking, for example, at some of the work that Malcolm Mosley and Steve Owen were doing on parish and village appraisals, looking at Malcolm's book on rural development in 2003, and he's got a chapter in there which is called Embracing the People, making an argument that we need to be doing community development, working with communities rather than doing this kind of extracted research. So we've had this bunch of great early innovators, and what's really interesting in the examples that we were sent is a couple of things. One is the work that we do around what we might call co-design, and I'll show you a slide to give you some examples in a moment. And related to that, the work that we do around participatory evaluation. So both of these two elements are kind of fairly often interconnected in the work that we do. Sometimes they're around program evaluations, sometimes it's about evaluation of particular policy mechanisms. So you've seen some of the examples that Alice was showing, for example, in relation to that. The final thing, which is our kind of new phase of participatory research, is what we're calling co-experimentation. So we'll explain some of that in a moment. So some examples of co-design and some pictures. John sent me loads of stuff, so I thought I've got to include some of John's stuff, and particularly some of the great pictures that he sent me. But you can see here the range of different kind of what I would call thematic domains that this kind of process of working crosses through. It's from kind of rural policy development, design. So the example here was some work that Janet was involved with, John, Paul, Katerina, co-designing or helping the development of the rural development program for Malta, for instance. This is just one example. We've already heard today some of the work that's going on around natural resource policy making in relation to, for example, common land. Again, John sent me lots of stuff. from back in 2003 to 06. The paper there, that's a new paper that Julie and colleagues have just published, which is looking at both fisheries and tree health initiatives around co-design. Some of the work that I've been doing with Charlotte, with Gareth Entercott and colleagues around animal disease management has an increasingly co-design feature to it. And the development of these types of methodologies, particularly to support DEFRA and the devolved nations, the stuff I'm interested in relates to vaccination. And you've already heard again from Chris's talk, for example, and from Julie's talk around the work that we do in relation to both agri-environmental policy and increasingly the delivery of public goods. So that's the WILD acronym is a water-based project, catchment-based project that's had a really interesting piece of work, and that's the Horizon project as well, called Pegasus. So that's the kind of history. And so what I thought I'd do is be slightly opportunistic and share a recent paper that we've just published. But I also want to kind of situate the rural a little bit in a kind of new paradigm of what we're calling planetary ruralization. Now, this is a paper that I've been just finished with a colleague in Taiwan and Mike Woods at Aberystwyth. And it's partly to counter a big literature on something called planetary urbanization. But the other thing that we're trying to do in this paper is to establish a new research agenda for rural studies and for the way that we position the rural in relation to the planetary crisis. So we've got kind of three elements in the paper, and I'm just going to show you some pictures for each of those. The first one is to situate the rural as what we call a space of crisis. So we've already heard a little bit of this in some of the talks, and that can be a space of crisis both in a kind of representational sense. So the images that we see of crisis are kind of anchored in the rural, be that in relation to pandemics, in relation to kind of environmental issues around dust storms, around wildfires, etc. So the rural has become, at one hand, a space of crisis, and it has also become a space of what we're terming conflict. So not only is it a space of crisis and a victim of crisis, it's also a space of conflict, both in terms of the dynamic between the rural and the urban, or the urban and the rural. So if we think about, for example, some of the issues around agriculture, around greenhouse gas emissions, related to some of, for example, Pippa's work, but also other issues around mining, around resources, etc. So that's a kind of rural-urban dynamic, but it's also an intra-rural form of conflict. So these are quite tricky issues that we're facing with at the moment. But in the paper and the way that we're framing a lot of our experimental work, our kind of democratic work around climathons, for example, is to also see the rural as a space of hope, as a site where solutions can be co-produced and co-created from, for example, things like, the excitement that we see around groundswell and the excitement that we see around regenerative agriculture, but also a reframing of rural resources around new forms of biological economy, around the way that we think about our soil as a kind of also kind of non-human property as well as a human property, and the way in which we embrace particularly procedural forms of justice, the way that we engage with rural stakeholders to try to build hopeful solutions in their terms. So that is the kind of context, if you like, for which we now situate the work that we're doing around this method called a living lab as a form of what we describe as co-experimentation. And as you can see there's a range of colleagues that have been working on different projects. Aimee and I are going to talk about two, ROBUST and RUSTIK. They've always got these very nice acronyms. Can't do an EU project without an acronym. Anyway, so don't worry, I'm not going to do this kind of participation stuff this time, but just to briefly define what a living lab is. So it comes from a kind of IT, techie kind of origin, but it's been mobilized in different ways through a range of different projects, particularly in sort of transition studies. So I've just chucked in a couple of definitions there to get you to think about it. It's a kind of physical or virtual space to solve societal challenges. It can be both an arena, so geographically bounded, or an approach for kind of intentional collaborative governance. There's now a range of different types or typologies of living labs, from kind of urban living labs through to things like lighthouses, which is a new term that I've come across. But what we've tried to do in our work is to embrace the kind of underlying principles of a living lab. So situating it in a context of geographical embeddedness in a kind of place-based environment, placing in particular an emphasis on experimentation and learning, processes of participation and leadership, but also collaboration, and ongoing cycles of evaluation. To kind of embrace all of that, we've then got to try to implement it in a kind of sense, and particularly in these big projects where you have to help partners and guide them through. So we've been developing a kind of sequencing of processes to guide this new form of what we call sort of co-innovation. So starting with a kind of phase where you begin to envision what the experiments might be, and then into kind of further testing those through kind of initial phases of experimentation and deeper analysis, with an ongoing cycle of monitoring and evaluation. So monitoring is actually really critical in these transdisciplinary projects. Yeah, they're kind of like feedback loops as you work through the process. So this is very briefly the ROBUST project, which Dan and Matt and I and Chris were involved with. And the brief from the commission was to find new solutions to strengthen rural-urban linkages. So this was framed actually at the time through the language of things like smart specialization and a kind of economy of growth, basically. We ended up critiquing that, actually, but anyway, that's just fun and interesting. But that was our brief, and we were using experimentation and using the living lab mechanism as a way to kind of build future systems, to build future pathways for transition, organized across a series of kind of rural-urban, if you like, functionalities or communities of practice, so food, ecosystem services, labor markets, infrastructure, and cultural connections. So this is our kind of network. Again, we had a range of case studies. We had 11 living labs distributed across different parts of Europe. In this particular piece of work, we were the academic partner working very closely with a research partner. So we worked with the Gloucestershire County Council, got to know a lot more about how that kind of organisation works, which is quite interesting. And we also had a case study of Wales, which was led by Mike Woods, which again was very, very interesting. I thought I'd just show you this table to kind of end my bit and then pass over to Aimee, just to show, there's an awful lot in this table actually, it took absolutely ages to put it together, but one of our jobs was to try and synthesize the innovations that were coming out of the work. So we did that by stratifying it in terms of different forms of rural-urban linkage, but also thinking about the different types of innovation output that you can get from this sort of work. So some of it related to kind of the generation or co-generation of knowledge and data. But what was particularly interesting was the work that was done around things like strategic visioning. So to keep it UK-based, the team in Mid Wales, for example, produced a kind of rural vision for Wales, which was really interesting. And in terms of the novel policy development, one of the things that we tried partially successfully to do in the Gloucestershire case was to get the county council to think about the possibility of having a dynamic procurement platform in their new school food contract. So you're able to use these methodologies to experiment with these types of examples. So I'm going to be quiet now and pass you over to Aimee, who's going to talk a little bit more about RUSTIK.
Thank you.
Over to you, Aimee.
So RUSTIK is again a Horizon Europe project that started last year, and our contribution is also funded by Innovate UK. So it's myself, Janet, Bryony, Katerina, Demelza and Dan working on this project. And you can see up there the aims and what we're doing in the living labs. So in the last year, we've worked with our project partners in the UK. So we have 2 living labs in the UK, Gloucestershire, where we're working with Gloucestershire Rural Community Council, and Monmouthshire, where we're working with the County Council, to explore the functions of those areas, so consumption, production and ecosystem services, to explore the transitions that those areas are currently going through, and considering what a sustainable transition looks like, and the data required to kind of inform our approaches to those transitions. So a key output of RUSTIK will be a database which collects data at a European level, which can then be viewed by people who are looking to go through transitions and to improve policy approaches for those transitions. So in the living labs, we're really exploring how those transitions are being navigated. We're looking at what data is already available and what data organizations and institutions would really value. So what the gaps are, and also where the gaps are in capabilities. So if organizations perhaps don't have someone who is able to do GIS, as we do here, for example. And to try it out in practice. So as Damian said, a key focus is kind of that experimentation. So we're at a stage now with the living labs where we're focusing in on something, a key issue for each area, and we'll experiment to try and work out how we can get the data required to properly inform the issue and transition. And the plan, as you'll see in a second, we're kind of still in the early phases of the project, but it will be to share collective learning. And so we meet regularly online as Living Lab coordinators, and we'll be meeting as a whole project soon in Parma in Italy to share our learning and to kind of move both the project forward and also thinking about how we can inform future policy. So again, it seems every project has a nice little diagram. So these are our project partners for RUSTIK. And you'll see there we've got Gloucestershire and Monmouthshire, which is in itself a very interesting kind of context to be working in. We found when we did policy reviews, obviously, Gloucestershire very much influenced by UK government policy, but the Welsh policy situation is somewhat different. And so it's been interesting to explore how each organisation has been approaching the transitions and how they've been influenced by the policies operating in both regions. And this is just a project timeline to give a sense of where we are now. So as I said, we're starting to get to a point where we're identifying key issues that the organisations we're working with would like to focus on, and we're thinking about what the experiment might look like. And the next phase, which will begin in January next year, is actually completing that experiment itself. And then we'll go through a process of learning, and as Damian said, throughout all of this as well, there is that process of monitoring and evaluation and feeding back. So what we're really trying to do, particularly as Work Package 3, which is kind of the focus of, well, our focus is living labs, is to give people an opportunity to reflect on what they've done at each cycle, and to look back and consider what they've learned about their region, and what they could perhaps either do better or bring back into the next cycle as well. So that's something that we're really focusing on and encouraging partners to think about through writing living lab reports. So that's all for RUSTIK. Just some closing remarks. Yeah. So I think, as Damian has highlighted, there is a need for these participatory dialogues, and I think it's something that we're probably all aware of across all of the work that we do in this room. And there is a particular focus now on just and sustainable transitions. And here we've got from the ground up, but I think it also speaks back to the presentation earlier in the Climathon about bottom up, top down, where do we meet in the middle? How do we create a space in which all voices can be heard from all angles, rather than just kind of considering it as a top-down issue or a bottom-up issue? And so, again, importantly, it's creating that space for respectful dialogue, and thinking more, again, about kind of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches. How can we bring creative ideas into our projects to support more people to get involved and start thinking about local solutions? And again, that's something that we can do through living labs, and I think importantly with the living labs is about building those longer term relations. So as Damian mentioned, kind of working with the county council, their relationships that we continue today, and similarly I know that we've developed relationships that have then gone on to become project partnerships too. So really thinking about how we as researchers in both the Research Institute and the university work together and for Gloucestershire and the wider communities. And finally, I think, you know, it's a chance for us to reflect on our roles and skills as rural social researchers as well. So I think, you know, maybe thinking back to when I started my undergraduate course and my PhD, whether or not I thought I'd be doing methods such as living labs. It's not something that I remember being taught at that level. So it's kind of developing our skills. And I think, again, that kind of speaks back to the CCRI as a supportive place for personal and professional development as well. We've recognised that, you know, there's a group of us working on these participatory methods, and it's an opportunity for us to develop new skills as rural social researchers. So thank you very much.